I'm excited for this next session here. It's security and industrial strategy in the age of AI. And moderating today's session, we have Venice Goodwine, who is, among other things, an ICIT Fellow, but she currently serves as the Chief Information Officer and AI Product Officer at Arlo Solutions. Prior to that, she had a storied career in the U.S. government, culminating at the U.S. Air Force and Space Force as the CIO. Venus, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, ICIT. I am excited to continue this conversation. And so let me set the stage a little bit before we get started. Really, the background of this conversation is rooted in CMU's report, Electrotech Moneyball. And if you haven't read it, please do. It is very, very good and enlightening. But before I get started in that and set the stage, let me allow my awesome panel to introduce themselves first. I'll start with you.
Okay, I'm David Mussington. Currently, I'm a very boring professor of the practice at the University of Maryland, College Park. Previously, I had a slightly more exciting title as Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at CISA, where many of the programs Nick Anderson described today had some of their genesis, so it was nice to hear that some of them are still continuing. I'm publishing in AI governance, in risk assessment for critical infrastructure, and in cyber defense in an AI environment as a problem for critical infrastructure in the US, but also as a problem for military cyber defense in NATO and elsewhere.
Great, thanks. Hi, I'm Phoebe Benich. I'm a fellow with Carnegie Mellon's Institute for Strategy and Technology. I'll talk more about the report that Venus mentioned in a bit, but most recently served as Director for Strategic Risk at the White House Office of the National Cyber Director, and before that was at In-Q-Tel, where I worked with some of our cyber, AI, and microelectronics companies.
Okay. And so our panel is titled Strain to Strength and Securing the AI-Driven Energy Build-Out. So let me put your mind at ease, and I want you to think about this. The title alone is the whole argument, from strain to strength, just those 4 words. So when you think about that, let's talk about the strain for a minute. Imagine the United States today is building a grid that will power the next half century of prosperity. You agree? But here it is. It's driven by AI. It's driven by it's driven by the reindustrialization of our supply chain. It's a whole new build out that we're not used to. We don't have a governance structure for the capacity that we're building. I'm not talking transmission lines. I'm not talking about transformers. I'm talking about the governance structure that guide us today. We heard it today. Continuing resolutions, budgets, workforce, all of those things. But what I want to talk about is I don't want us to miss the fact that we're digitizing the grid itself, that we're giving it what I think Phoebe would agree, a digital nervous system. Think about software-defined batteries, inverters, orchestration platforms, all of that. But here's where the strain gets a little dangerous. The components that we use come from our major strategic competitor. These components come out of Beijing. So when you think of that, the very thing that we rely on is also the very thing that's also a threat to us. So today, what is our issue? When we think about strength, our strength really is how do we address that issue? I think it's discipline. So this panel today is going to talk about that discipline. We're going to speak to a framework that we could use, and we're going to talk about the defense of that. So Phoebe, let me start with you. Set the scene. So when we talk about 2 connected stories, the energy and the infrastructure, set the stage for us, first of all, when you think about this Electrotech, that stack. Let's start there, and let's talk about these 2 competing areas of tension between securing it and also using it.
Yeah, thanks, Venus. So, and I should have said in my intro also, thanks to ICIT for having us today. This is going to be a great conversation, I think. So, right, as Venus said, the AI build out is driving a digitization of our grid. The batteries, virtual power plants, all of these technologies make up a term that we sort of stole from a UK think tank, Ember, that we're calling Electrotech. And this is sort of the whole set of technologies that make up our energy infrastructures or electrical infrastructures, central nervous system. But it's important to note that that's not just core to energy infrastructure that all, Electrotech spans defense, transportation, comms, and IT. So this set of technologies is hugely important. And as Venus said, the same digital transformation that is helping our grid become more defensible is also making us more dependent on China and other adversaries to help build it. So we're faced with this sort of two-sided future for our Electrotech build-out. And what does that look like? So the optimistic future is real and achievable. If we're deploying these software-defined and digitally native technologies, they can help make our grid more defensible than their analog predecessors. And so what did that look like? The legacy infrastructure where we have hardwired systems bolted onto network connectivity that they were never designed for. And that's where our adversaries have really been exploiting, getting a foothold and exploiting the seams for years between those analog systems and the modern systems that are being bolted on rather awkwardly. The Electrotech systems that we're starting to deploy are built differently. They're networked by design, which means that they're able to monitor and patch systems automatically. When something goes wrong, they can generate that forensic record that we need to respond. So done right, this not only modernizes our grid, but helps minimize the capacity for bad actors to take advantage of accesses they previously had been utilizing. But the other hand, the pessimistic future is also possible. If our Electrotech components are sourced without scrutiny or governed without standards, then that same connectivity that helps our grid become more connected or more modern also provides a greater attack surface. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those threats look like, but I think just a good starting point to lay out that the infrastructure we're building today has great ramifications for the decisions that we're making today will have great ramifications years down the line.
And so, David, you've spent a lot of your time at the intersection of cyber threat and critical infrastructure. So when you hear Phoebe talk about these sort of these threats that AI and energy and data centers and all of those things, how does that sit differently than we've talked about cyber threats in the past now that it's AI enabled?
So I think the real change is the velocity of vulnerability discovery and system exploitation that comes with the adoption of AI. So with the positives of AI for Electrotech and other new infrastructures that can be more resilient than prior infrastructures, just to level set us, I'm not sure I'm as optimistic about how well protected our existing infrastructures are, let alone the new ones. And as someone who used to be at CISA and used to talk about zero trust a lot and used to talk about living off the land a lot, I'm always worried about uplift of capabilities of people who own assets and infrastructure already, and what they'll do in the transition between analog legacy infrastructure with tech debt and how they will finance the CapEx that we're looking at for the next 3 or 4 years. I look at AI data centers and I look at trillions of dollars of core infrastructure, new critical infrastructure actually, that's being built based on new concepts, many of them similar or intersecting with Electrotech concepts. And I wonder about their security models, their threat models, their interpretability in terms of model acquisition. And am I an optimist about that? I like to think I'm a realist about that, which means partial adaptation, partial implementation of best practices, but with gaps. And those gaps happen to exist at the same time as living off the land and major peer competition. That is a dangerous situation.
We had to set the stage with the optimism, and then you can come in and tell us why we should be worried about that.
We'll choose sides when we're all done.
Yeah.
And so we are all familiar with Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Brimstone, all of those things. But Phoebe, can you break for me, let's unpack the difference in the type of cyber intrusion and threats that we're normally speaking of with those type of attacks living off the land. Let's unpack what you're speaking about from a cyber perspective.
Yeah, and important to note, so we tried to be as precise as possible in our paper about exactly what kinds of threats we're talking about, because all too often, policy will collapse all the threats into one as just supply chain security. And when we use that term, what do we mean? So important to break out, right? There is the cyber threat that David talked about, which is really a day one emergency if a bad actor were to get access to a grid-connected technology and have great consequences, whether that be shutting down the grid destabilization, et cetera. That is separate from the economic dependency risk, which is, we like to say, a much slower rolling crisis, a crisis of future deployment. If China, controlling massive swaths of our electrotech supply chains were to cut us off from particular electrotech components, or if we were worst case scenario in conflict and cargo ships are getting sunk in the Pacific, the Chinese technologies that we've already deployed, the solar panels, the batteries, will continue to generate electricity in the country, in the States. We will be impaired from future deployment of technologies we might be dependent on, but that's not a day one emergency in the same way that a Volt Typhoon actor could potentially have grave ramifications for grid or other infrastructure. The third type of threat, though, that we talk about is firmware dependency, which kind of threads the two together, which is that when you are dependent on massive amounts of Chinese products, you're also bringing in Chinese access to the firmware that accompanies those products, often for routine diagnostics and updates, but that provides that access for the vendors that could be potentially manipulated, creating horrific consequences for the grid should that be in the wrong hands. So important to disambiguate between the types of threats that we're talking about, because that is where we really unlock the potential upside if we're using the right policy tools for each.
But also, David, let me bring you in, because the frontier AI models are changing the game in this space, right? Every CISO in here will tell you today, there is so much noise that their defenders get. And just now, things like Mythos will help bring more of that noise to light to them. So when you think about the frontier models, how do we now address that issue with our defenders and now to defend our critical infrastructure?
So I think first thing we might do, and this sort of goes into my recommendations, which is give critical...
Your mic. They won't be able to hear you.
Thank you. First thing I think is we should give defenders access to frontier models for defense. We've seen frontier models. We already heard this morning about DOD and others, the Department of War, and others getting access to frontier models. It would be a shame if the critical infrastructures, rural water, rural electrification, rural EMS, rural public safety, were the last people to get access to better cyber defenses. These are the entities that confront a potential avalanche of vulnerability as the offense exploits discoverable vulnerabilities at scale while the critical infrastructures read about it in their newspapers or see it on television. That would be tragic. So that would be first. I think second would be understanding that it's not just frontier models. It is broadly distributed large language models, which if used properly through orchestration, can give you 80 to 90% of what a frontier model will give you if you're an attacker. Defenders need to understand that and organize themselves accordingly. And ICIT has some recent work that explores that risk challenge. The risk challenge is not just frontier AI, it is the new risk environment that we all confront, and it's the one that will confront Electrotech as it's deployed.
But before I move to you, Phoebe, to talk about some sort of calculus, so for you, David, this urgency calculus around now all of this information and around vulnerabilities and the threat actors and the tool they now have available to them, how does the urgency change now with this? And what should we do differently?
We should deploy defenses, I think, more urgently. We should deploy, or be in more of a hurry to deploy defenses urgently to take care of existing living off the land cyber hygiene risks. First thing, clean up your act first before you confront amplified, empowered actors who will then use offensive AI tools against you, against any vulnerabilities you leave unaddressed. That is the urgency.
And so in the cybersecurity world, we've often talked about having HBOM and SBOM, hardware, software, bill of materials, so we'll understand what's in our systems, all the components. But so Phoebe, for you, from a policymaker's perspective, walk us through how they should prioritize these threat vectors, because if we treat every Chinese component like a 5-alarm fire, then we're playing whack-a-mole. So what type of framework do you think we could use to talk to the policymakers about?
Yeah, and I would say first, I think the most strategically underweighted danger to our energy ecosystem or our general critical infrastructure doesn't come from Beijing, but from our own potential policy paralysis. If we treat every Chinese component with blanket restrictions, treating them all as equally dangerous, then we will not only throttle the build-out we need, but fail to secure the components that actually matter. So, and moreover, I would say that kind of blanket restriction approach also hands our adversaries this ready-made narrative that legitimate security concerns are just thinly veiled protectionism. So in thinking about this and responding to this, in our paper we developed this framework which looks at 3 questions, of which risk is actually only one of them, because it's important, I think, to look at the Electrotech stack amongst a whole range of considerations. So the first is, how urgent is the deployment of that component, and how close is the cost curve lock-in? Are these technologies that we need right now, or are these technologies that we can bake in industrial policy for to help reshore or partner or ally shore? Second question is, where does that technical risk concentrate? So this is the question we've kind of been, I think, focusing on most, but which is really, where on the smart to dumb spectrum does this component fall? Are we talking about the battery management systems, the control layers that run our electrotech and energy infrastructure, or are we talking about the electrochemical goo inside the batteries that China supplies? You cannot hack the goo, but you can hack the control layer. And then the third question of our framework is, how much industrial advantage does US or allied leadership in this technology confer into other sectors? As we've talked about, Electrotech is not only valuable in the energy infrastructure, but can be hugely important and critical to defense, transportation, et cetera. We talk a lot about how Electrotech is everything, right? And even cheekily, like, Electrotech is Taco Bell. It is the same 4 ingredients, just packaged in a taco versus a burrito. And a drone is an EV, is a phone. These are all lots of similar ingredients that we're packaging in different ways. So are we ensuring that we're focusing on the components that will give us the greatest opportunity? So based on that assessment, we have a 3-tiered sorting mechanism, which is that first tier is where we want to have really tight domestic sourcing for our most valuable control layers. This would be our battery management system that runs the batteries that are powering our AI data centers and powering other defense tech infrastructure. The second is, of course, allied and partner sourcing, where we can have a little bit more leeway, don't necessarily need to be sourcing it in the States directly. And the third is where we can have more global managed procurement. That's where we feel comfortable sourcing with transparency and testing requirements, but where we have some urgency to deploy some of these components more imminently. These are the solar panels, for example. While solar panels can sometimes come connected with inverters independently, they are on the dumber side of the spectrum, and so don't need to carry the same security risk as fleet orchestration software, for example. And so, yeah, we think that by using this framework, we can really help disambiguate both the risk, but also the opportunity for the United States.
So what Phoebe's talking about also is the blast radius, right? We talked about that in your framework. We talked about the deployment urgency. We talked about the industrial competitiveness. So David, with your expertise, who's most exposed and why? And what do defenders need to do about it?
So I think the best thing that defenders can do is make themselves aware of the technologies that are available to them on the AI side to make sure that they can leverage some of the defensive opportunities that are available to secure their assets and secure their operations. I think that, so information from official sources and information from their supply chain partners. I think second, understanding that artificial intelligence has huge benefits, defensive and productive benefits, that can make Electrotech 1, 2, 3x more profitable for them, so that this should not slow down technology acquisition. But the last thing I think is very important is that don't think that adoption is an option. It's here, and if you don't adopt some sort of policy or approach that's structured, then the risk environment can get very harsh very quickly.
And so, Phoebe, you talked about triage, but let's triage without panic and paralysis. And here in Congress, we always think about paralysis as budgeting or continuous resolutions, or we talked today about a workforce issue. So from your perspective, what is it exactly are we asking our policymakers to do so that this paralysis doesn't take hold, but we also keep our competitive advantage? If you think about the implication of the executive order for AI or our recent NISPOM that came out recently. So when you think about those type of strategic instruments, how do you address that?
Yeah, and when I talk about paralysis, I'm talking about overly prescriptive regulation that paralyzes the infrastructure build out we're trying to complete. Not necessarily that we're not making policy, although I guess that is also a form of paralysis. We have many sorts, yes. And so I think for policymakers, it's important to be distinguishing between not component level risk, right? We're not just talking about like banning all cattle batteries, but within the battery, what are the actual sources of risk, and where we would actually want to have domestic leadership, and we would want to have domestically sourced components. And I think it's important so we also talk about sort of distinguishing between use cases. Household inverters are very different from utility scale inverters. So which are the components that are at the most critical junctures in our critical infrastructure that, if they were compromised, would have grave damage to our ecosystem? And so I think this means legislating at that component level within products, not saying we're banning all Huawei products as a whole, but like being more precise about what are the components that we view as important for the US to be sourcing versus allies and partners we can accept a little more risk versus more globally. And I think that is also not just about, it's also using, we've talked a lot about regulation and how that can slow down industry, and regulation often operates on timelines that are just totally incongruent with industry business plans. So I think there's a couple of approaches. One is working with these hyperscalers that are building out data centers to ensure that they are aware of what done well looks like, and that through power purchase agreements, they sort of voluntarily agree to be sourcing particular key components from trusted partners. And that is, voluntary is not guaranteed, but I think it is potentially a quicker starting point than saying, we as the federal government, as CISA, as FERC, are going to be instituting regulatory changes to how you all think about your energy infrastructure.
And so, David, when you hear that and we think about our strain to our strength, so the strain, as you described it, it's really our defenders not having ready access, one, to some of the tools. But when you think about the strength, how do we address that side of this equation?
Well, I'm one who believes, after being a generalist most of my life, that specifics are important. So specific assistance to entities that are in need. Entities that bear burdens of risk but don't have the expertise to respond need targeted assistance. That means information. It means sector risk management agencies talking to their sectors and encouraging and incentivizing activity that will measurably reduce risk from AI or any other source. I think second, it means priorities, prioritizing certain sectors over others. I think for a long time, policy has acted as if we have 16 critical infrastructures and they're all equal. Of course, they're all equal in the eyes of God, but they may not all be equal in the targeting intensity of our principal adversaries. So we need to make some priorities. Third, we need to realize that outside of Washington and our major cities, a lot of America doesn't have a lot of knowledge or information or access to basic defensive techniques, let alone cyber hygiene. And we need to prioritize helping Americans to defend themselves.
And this is for both of you. If you, in the next 12 months, what would you like to see done? What would success look like based on what we've described here today? AI-enabled threats are going to increase. They already have, because now AI is in everything, in your home, in our workplace. And then we now know that AI is the future. So we need all of this infrastructure as well. So thinking from a critical infrastructure perspective and a workforce perspective and a defender perspective, what should we do in the next 12 months? Big question.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be done. I think the value of the framework that we propose is that by focusing on the components that we assess matter most, that buys us headroom and buys us time to then develop medium to longer term industrial strategy for the components that maybe we view as less urgent or carrying less technical risk. So I do think it is about using a very narrow spear to put restrictions on the most important components that either carry incredible technical risk or where we want to have incredible US leadership and that are important and urgent to our AI build out, and having maybe narrow use cases for these kinds of restrictions, like just within the Pentagon, are we looking at our most sensitive infrastructure and ensuring that those critical junctures are, the brain that's operating those systems is American made without access that we wouldn't want our adversaries to have. And then using that as sort of a starting point so that we can then build out longer term plans that might take 1 to 2 to 3 years. I think signaling this with allies and partners is also hugely important. We've been kind of glossing over that second tier, but in order to have a coordinated strategy that doesn't just rely on US sourcing, we do need to be going out and talking with our allies and partners about how they're building their electrotech supply chains and how we can minimize duplication and work together in these spaces.
David, you.
I will ditto all of that because I don't know much about electrotech, but this all sounds sensible to me. A couple of things. One, I'd like to see, and I think I've said this multiple times, so I'll say it again, I'd like to see critical infrastructures themselves get access to frontier models for defense as a priority initiative of the federal government. We have Project Glasswing, organized by Anthropic. There's federal, White House, Treasury, and other efforts at the same tier. I'd like to see that aimed at critical infrastructures in states where Americans live and where our industry is. I'd like to see that for a specific reason, which is with electrotech and other efficiencies coming from advanced technology, we have two major deadlines coming up, one of which is Q-Day. Quantum computers arriving in a few years. And the second is over $2 trillion of AI data center investment, which is going to propagate potentially at-risk new infrastructure, which if we don't get the near-term stuff right, we're going to be more at risk in a few years than we are now.
So we started the conversation asking whether the AI-driven build-out is going to make us stronger or to make us more exposed. What's your thoughts? Yes? More exposed or make us stronger? I think I think the panel today, I think it's undetermined, but I think there are some decisions that need to be made that will determine which side we land on in either one of those. And so not only rather it's the defender gap, but I think it's also understanding what this electrotech actually is, a critical infrastructure, and then how do we secure it a little bit better in working with our partners. So Phoebe and David, before we end, any last words for our panel, for our team here?
I think just that like this is an opportunity, not just for us to shore up and better defend our critical infrastructure, but also for us to regain some leadership potentially in sectors that we may have previously conceded to adversaries. And like we've talked about, the leadership in some of these technologies is not only essential to these hyperscalers building out AI data centers, but also will be crucial to the future of warfare and the greater electrification of our society.
And so just in closing, that's our terrain. The terrain today, we talked about the strain, we talked about the strength and the critical infrastructure. But I think moving forward, to your point, we need to have a framework that helps us systematically organize and identify the threats and which ones we're going to attack first, because there is so much noise coming in. So I think the framework that you identified in the report is a good starting point for us. But I think also, David, you brought to bear that we definitely need to have the workforce that have the tools in their hands so they can practice defending and, if need, respond. So, you wanted to?
Just to say
Off the stage.
that the capabilities we deploy may in fact not be human, and that we should learn how to balance workforce with our new AI partners.
All right. Well, thank you both. I appreciate your insights on that. And thank you all for listening.